Good afternoon. It is 3 p.m. on Thursday, June 26th, 2025, and this regular meeting of the Sandpoint Urban Forestry Commission is now called to order in council chambers at City Hall, 1123 West Lake Street, Sandpoint, Idaho. For the record, I am Commission Chair Mose Dunkel presiding. Also present are Vice Chair Chase Youngdahl and Commissioners Preston Andrews and Jeff Gregory. Commissioner Paige Belfry is absent. In addition to our board members, City Council Liaison Kyle Schreiber and City Staff Liaison Eric Bush are present, along with Deputy Clerk Haley Keys serving as our board clerk today. At this time, I'd entertain a motion to approve the minutes from our May 22nd, 2025 meeting. So moved. Okay, been moved and seconded. All in favor? Any opposed? Okay, motion passes and the minutes are approved as presented. We don't have any members from the public that haven't identified themselves yet, and we don't have anybody on Zoom, I think. So we'll move on to our old business. We will continue our discussion on categories and definitions of heritage and other valuable trees in Sandpoint. Ask Eric to maybe catch us up with that.
Yeah, so after our meeting last month, we were kind of refining and continuing to talk about different categories and classifications under this. And one of the things that we discussed was inviting a member from the ACHP, Arts, Culture, and Historic Preservation Commission here, and Ellie has joined us today. You're the chair of the commission, right?
Correct.
So we're hoping to kind of get your input on the historical component of this categorization, and just to kind of bring you up to speed a little bit. We've been talking about like historical specimen tree, rare tree, and then like significant growth, meaning perhaps like the grove across the street at Pine Street Park. Those are kind of definitions we were kicking around, and there are terminology that we need to assign definitions to. And there's, I think, one or two others that we were potentially including, but it hasn't, been kind of formally decided upon.
Okay.
But we've talked through all of these definitions, I think, at pretty good length and kind of have, working definitions. But we haven't talked about the historical definition because we didn't have the expertise in the room, and we do today. So I'm kind of curious what your take is, and if you have seen this elsewhere or have any thoughts or considerations. And just to let me step back a little bit. Are you familiar with the Outstanding Trees of Sandpoint pamphlet that has been floating around? So part of this categorization is in service of kind of updating that. And, I think that was originally developed in 2006 or 2008, somewhere around that time frame. Point is, it's, been around for a while, and a number of the trees that are in there probably don't exist in town anymore. These definitions are in service of updating that, so we can have, kind of a new pamphlet to have at City Hall, or for folks that are coming into town, or folks that live here that want to go through and kind of do a scavenger hunt type thing to, see those trees and figure out where they are and all that sort of stuff. But one definition that we've been utilizing is from the city of Tumwater, Washington. It's just their kind of categorization. And they have historical, specimen, rare, and significant growth in their document. And their definition for historical is a tree which, by virtue of its age, its association with or contribution to a historical structure or district, or its association with a noted citizen or historical event. So that's kind of broad, and that I think is a reasonably good definition, but it may need to be updated, tweaked, refined for our purposes. But I think the intention with this entire conversation is to kind of have these trees defined and categorized so that, one, we know as members of this commission or staff members of this commission and we can disseminate that information, but also so we can kind of keep track and keep an eye on, those trees of value
Right,
throughout town.
absolutely. I think that's the most important part, is identifying those heritage trees and then making sure they're cared for.
Yeah. So, do you have, particular things that, from the kind of historical perspective that, that we should consider, things that are, important from your perspective or not important from your perspective? There's, I guess from the way I look at it, Sandpoint has an extremely rich history and we can highlight that in many different contexts, and that's part of what, your commission does. But how do we categorize that and do it appropriately with respect to trees in town? And, is it necessary or appropriate in certain contexts? I'm thinking like, we categorize a historical tree in a city park or on city-owned property somewhere. To, have a informational signage explaining, that, perhaps we work with you guys and the museum and both and,
Absolutely.
tell that story. I think that's pretty cool. And, what's your take on that?
I really like the idea of identifying them with signage, wayfinding. Is there actually an inventory yet of those that we would consider heritage trees?
Not yet. I think the kind of next step would be, one, looking at the outstanding trees document we do have,
Mhm.
seeing which of those trees are still around. And that's a great starting point, because somebody's already gone through that effort to,
Right.
categorize those. And, then determining which of those are historical. And I suppose some of them could be, multiple things. They could
Right.
be historical and also a specimen tree. Or also a rare tree, there's only a
Right.
few of them in town. But I think the overall intention is to categorize and know where they are. And in the case of historical, know the history if it's available.
Yeah, so I think first steps probably is to take that inventory, just go through that existing document and find out what is still there, what would be considered historic, and then go to the museum and utilize those volunteers to help find out documentation about the location of those trees, the people that may have been involved with those trees. And that can be difficult because the search engine at the museum is rudimentary at best. You can go by like street number, street name. If you have the information of the people that may have lived around there, or if there's historical buildings or homes, we can help with that and kind of narrow down the logistics of that. But we have good volunteers at the museum that have a lot of knowledge that I think we can tap into and kind of put the puzzle pieces together. That's the thing. Some of this historical research is basically trying to piece things together from, documents here, photos here, even the newspaper archives. There's a really great newspaper archive that sometimes you can do search words. So that might be something.
Is that something that you think the volunteers or staff of the museum would be, willing to help with?
A lot of times the museum will charge for that sort of thing, which they have to because
Sure.
they have to make some money off of that. But if we have volunteers here amongst the commission or even other, pull in other volunteers that might be interested. Some people just love to do research, and so those are the people that you have to bring in on this. The museum can help set the volunteers up to do, our volunteers to do that. So then that's an economical way to go.
Well, I guess one next step of this process would be to review the document we have, and the document's on our shared drive. If you all are familiar with where it is, it's on there. If not, we can, if you can't find it, we can, email a copy. And do you have a copy? I can certainly get you a copy as
You
well.
emailed me the copy.
I did, okay.
I think I do have another copy elsewhere.
Great.
And one thing I would maybe recommend about that is what our commission does is we create working teams. Depending on your quorum, you stay below a quorum and maybe you go out as a pair. Your quorum is here, but a pair or three people, and go ahead and just take a drive around and go just knock that list off and see what's out there and what's still standing, obviously, and then it's a great way to take inventory. It's easy. You are all together and you can discuss, throw ideas off each other. As opposed to everybody going out and doing it on independently.
Sure.
So,
7-member commission.
we have 9 when we're fully staffed, but, we're down to 7 right now, so. So we can keep it at,
And for the definition purposes of, historical within its categorization, is that something you would like, perhaps the working definition that I read? This conversation, would you like to discuss that with the ACHP as a commission?
sure,
In which case I can get you that language and
Okay.
kind of review it, and I'd be happy to come to a meeting
that'd be great.
if it's, something you guys wanted to put on an agenda.
Sure,
And just kind of, be an observer for that discussion. And I think we're, as the commission, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, pretty well, I think, set on some of the working definitions for the other categories. But like I said, we, I don't think have quite the knowledge or expertise to appropriately describe this one. And I'd like to make sure we get that right, because I think it is, a pretty important category in this conversation.
And there's specific mention currently in city code on looping in your commission on the each definition, so.
Well, I'll get you a copy of this document that we've been kind of using as a baseline from Tumwater.
okay,
And let me know if when you plan to include that in a
Okay.
agenda, and I'm happy to be there if you'd like. And, provide whatever input or discussion is appropriate.
sounds great.
Awesome.
And I think it is a good start for sure. I don't know how big Tumwater is, but, as far as like size of the city, but it seems like a pretty good start.
Yeah, and I don't know either off the top of my head, like population or square, city limits size, but I have reviewed and come across a number of their, code or council adopted documents or whatever they refer to it as a water. And they seem to be pretty refined, and, they put some thought into the documents they're preparing. So I think it's a good starting point. I never like to reinvent the wheel if somebody else has already, done a lot of the legwork.
25,000.
25,000, so yeah, not too much larger than Sandpoint, but I think that's probably an appropriate scale
And the
size.
only other thing I would add is maybe, there any other Idaho towns similar that have tree? Oh, interesting.
Nobody in Idaho has like a protected city class of trees. At least from. And I was surprised to know that.
Yeah.
Even Coeur d'Alene, I thought Coeur d'Alene did have something, but.
Okay.
Not that they don't have like the beginning or a very
Right,
light or minor something,
right,
but there's nothing that's like. They could like. Change zoning or anything like, it would change like development or something like if property owner had a tree on their property, especially like there's. Not, no, and then in the right of way. I brought this up specifically to legal. Said that in the right of way, if a developer. If that's the only way that they can access their property, then. Take the tree. Even if we had some sort of language that was. Trying to prevent that, we could probably like strongly suggest to
Right.
look for alternatives or something, which. Be better than nothing, but
Right.
People said it would be akin to a taking. Or something like that, so. So whatever we do, I think. Hopefully it's like meaningful and useful and. Is a guiding. Type of document or. Maybe down the road, it could be. Lead into something else, or maybe developers would have, like we talked about, like. There's incentives to
Right.
not. To not take a tree, and maybe there's some sort of. But even, well, I brought that up, that kind of started getting a little sticky too, which.
Right.
Yeah, wasn't quite as simple as I thought it would be.
Well, and honestly, it's the same way with historic. In Idaho, property rights. Are king, so. We could strongly suggest. And at this point, that's, education is a lot though.
Oh, yeah, and I think there's a big difference between, actual private property and city rights of way and city owned and managed properties.
And to Moses' point, I had a similar conversation with our legal team about this same type of discussion, and they said exactly what Moses just described. And the intent with this is not to, for legal, is not to preclude development or say, this tree is whatever categorization. That means you as a private property owner can't remove it if you're building, for example, otherwise complies with city code. There's no mechanism to, stop a development or require a development to redesign to, maintain a tree in that context. But in my experience, not so much with the private development side of things and, planning and zoning is, Moses' other, commission that he sits on with the city. Most folks are pretty reasonable. And if you can have a conversation with them and they're, building a single family house, for example, in a lot in South Sandpoint. And you're like, hey, we'd really like to maintain this tree. Would you be willing to move your driveway in this way? And that's not requiring them to do anything or rejecting their plans. We're legally not allowed to do that. But if you can have a conversation with people,
Absolutely.
a developer or a homeowner or what have you, many times people, in my experience, are willing to make some accommodations to maintain those. And I think that's where you can really make an impact without, going through a historic preservation like you were just describing.
Communication is key.
Yeah.
The other pathways that might be worth looking into would be conservation easement, which would work just like any other easement, and obviously you'd either have to compensate the owner for that in some way, or if they were really interested in protecting the tree, they might be willing to donate a conservation easement. But I've also had a conversation with a lawyer outside of the municipal setting that he also suggested looking into buying the timber rights. At that point, you could cut it down. It's not like a conservation easement where you could never cut it down, but you would be in control of when and how it gets cut down. So those might be two avenues to explore. If we were trying to preserve trees that are on private property, obviously, we can't force anybody to do it, but if, those might be the ways to protect something throughout a chain of ownership. If that house changes hands, it's still protected by a conservation easement. So I'm certainly not an expert, but that might be something to look into.
So what would the property owner get out of the conservation easement? Cause usually it's a trade-off of development rights or. Yeah, subdivision or something like that.
Mhm.
So would they be just would we be buying it or?
That could be one thing that the property owner would ask for. It's just straight up money. And again, you know, if somebody's lived in a house forever and really loves the tree outside, they might be willing to put it in a conservation easement just to make sure future owners don't cut that tree down. My understanding is the conversations that we had with one of the homeowners who lives on Cedar where the road expansion was set to happen, they really loved their trees out in the front, and maybe they'd be willing to put those trees into a conservation easement in exchange for giving us a little bit more right of way or something like that. So that we could route our sidewalk around their trees rather than having to cut them down. So you can get creative with it. And again, I'm not an expert, but it might be an avenue to explore if we do find a tree that has historical or some other value and it's on private property as opposed to city property.
And another avenue is leasing the timber rights or buying the timber rights should, you know, the city want to control then what happens with that in the future.
Yeah, and that I'm less clear on. But that was thrown out as a potential option by a lawyer to me at one point. So it would be worth looking into. I can't give you any specifics on.
Let's be seeing what could be, what's compatible with municipal statute and
Yeah,
city code and everything. In that
and
regard.
what you
Yeah.
get with the timber rights.
Yeah.
And responsibilities as well, because let's say that tree dies and you own the timber rights, are you now required to come cut it
No.
down and take care of it? And if it falls on somebody's house, is that your
Right.
responsibility? So it's definitely something that needs to be fully vetted, but just throwing that out there as, you know, additional avenues we could potentially take.
Yeah, and I can't speak to those from either, you know, any kind of legal perspective either. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer. My experience with conservation easements is, not in like a, you know, city limit setting.
Mhm.
It's with, you know, larger tracts of land where somebody wants to do kind of what you're describing, Kyle. In the context of, you know, they've got 1,000 acres and they put 800 of it under a conservation easement. When they sell their property or pass away or something down the line, that property could be maintained as is without, you know, subdivision, for example.
Yeah,
But that's an entirely different context, you know, my experience with that is focused more on like rural areas than within city limits, so I couldn't speak to what could or could not happen in that context in, you know, at a house in South Sandpoint, for example. But an interesting question.
So in regard to that, I think kind of tag along with that, there could be a future development in and around, well, in the city limits, but maybe in the downtown core hypothetically, where there's a lot of trees that have been there for a long time. And if some of these residential, current residential use, but they're in commercial area, they could be converted into way higher density, residential. And so trees in the right of way, which are not technically city owned trees, it's private property, city.
They are city owned.
So city
But
owned.
the responsibility for maintenance,
Yeah.
planting, and removal lies with the adjacent property owner. It's a bit confusing, but
Yeah.
that's how Idaho code's written in our, it's written.
So between the sidewalk and the curb, those trees would be potentially in jeopardy of like quite a few of them being gone. So there's been a little bit of discussion, or I feel some rumblings of the community wanting to protect those trees. But there's not exactly any way to do that, I don't think there's any like, yeah, we can just say no. Or, hey, you gotta figure out a different way, because if we would stop them from their development, then they would have a case.
Right.
So what other, and I don't know, like, what other ways are there to, you know, alternatives that we can give to potential development or developers, or just even if it is a single family home, but it's just much bigger, or it's not super high density, but it's like a fourplex or something like that, but it takes up more space and they need the access. And that tree is way bigger than it was when they first built there. So it is a legitimate thing of, well, yeah, there isn't as easy of access now. And, so anyway, just some, you know, there may not be a way to stop all of it, you know, to where some of the trees are gonna be gone. And, but if there's a way to make something that works, you know, it gets the outcome that everybody wants and they get their development rights still and they get to, you know, put up what they want, but hopefully, you know, not take out the trees, you know, just because right now it's kind of a case of like, they could just say, well, we just want them gone, you know. You really can't stop that, so. Yeah,
Yeah, it's a far more complicated issue than it seems on the surface, you know, as you could, until you dive into the details, you could look at it from, you know, like the perspective of the city forester. And I review and approve or deny tree permits based on what our code says. And I am unable to deny a tree removal for a development, for example, if the development complies with code. And that's height, that's setback, that's all those things. If they comply with the zoning code elsewhere and their building, you know, would obstruct a tree or what have you. The way code and the way the interpretation from legal is that, we have no bearing to preclude them from removing that tree, kind of like what Moses was describing.
yeah, so until we had like strong suggestive language that was like, hey, here's something to consider, you know, and I don't know, you know, maybe it's, I mean, the thing of like, hey, you gotta plant a tree somewhere else in town, that just makes things way smoother. Maybe that is best we can get, or something similar to that. I'm not sure. I mean, I think when it really comes down to it, they could say no to that too. But,
Right.
but, um, like I said, going back to the public perception of what's going on is that the city is allowing development to just do whatever they want, which it's not the city, it's not us that's doing that, it's state law.
We do live in Idaho.
Yeah, we
right?
live in Idaho, you know, good or bad or, you know, whatever. So that's not something that we're not gonna change state law. And I think if we tried, I'm sure it would not. Well, I'm not sure, but I have a hunch that it wouldn't go. Yeah, Boise, yeah, it wouldn't, yeah, it wouldn't even get out of the committee, I don't think. I don't think so either.
So that's a good point. Have you researched any cities in the country that have really strong zoning laws on heritage trees or any kind of trees?
I have not.
Nothing that I've come across. I tend to think of, cities like, you know, Boston, Massachusetts, that has. It's just sort of due to the, you know, history and age of Boston. But even Boston, for example, I don't know that they have that sort of mechanism. They do for historic buildings,
Right.
especially if they're on the National Register. But that's a different kind of, you know, different
Yeah.
case entirely than, something with a tree.
Well, it'd be interesting to find somewhere that has that and then kind of compare. I mean, like you say, who knows how far we could get with it, but at least knowing that information and what a community has actually been able to do and how that actually plays out in real life. If they get a lot of pushback or, I mean,
Yeah.
it'd be interesting to find that out.
Buzz, do you recall when we were finalizing the comp plan, there was some folks who were outspoken about trees and one of them was related to a city planner in the Portland area? She
Yeah.
gave us some documentation on recommendations.
Yeah, and I think that maybe, I think what I remember is it tied in with, there could be like, you know, setback adjustments
Yeah,
to keep a tree on private property, I think was mostly the intent of what I remember. And I think there's already that mechanism now with like a conditional use permit or something, or variance maybe. So And I think it's like a once every 10 years kind of a thing that would come up too, especially on private property.
Yes.
And I think on private property, we're like, it's a really big uphill battle to get very far with any of that. In the right of way, I think there's room for something. So yeah, there could be some research done for sure.
I was just thinking that if we could track down her details, then maybe she'd
Yeah.
be a good resource like you were talking about. Sounded like wherever she was from had stronger protections. I couldn't remember exactly where, but I want to say
Yeah.
Western Oregon.
Yeah, I can't remember either. That would have been like in August of 23,
I was
maybe.
there, yeah.
Yeah,
It was a while ago. But yeah, they had some pertinent information, I think. I mean, in a different area, different state, which
right.
they,
But
yeah.
to the end of not reinventing the wheel, maybe they
Yeah.
have some tips.
At least a place to start. I
Right.
mean, to gather blueprints. I mean, we need to make this, it's Sandpoint, Idaho. It should fit Sandpoint, Idaho, but but taking, I guess blueprints to at least have baseline ideas.
Yeah, things that we probably hadn't thought of, you know.
Yeah, but I mean, I'd like to focus my energies on, rights of way,
Mhm.
trees, where maybe make some kind of meaningful difference with certain protections. I mean, and right of way laws are complex, and municipal rights of way are different than county and state rights of way, but that might take looping in the legal team if we really dive down that, but
Yeah. Yeah, it might be good to, well, at least talk to legal again and see if, let them know what we're looking at, and if there is any type of thing that would have any kind of teeth at all to help. Um, or, and if there isn't anything, then I don't know that if there's just like a resolution from this commission and the historic commission as well, that says our intent is to not, take down certain trees especially. If they fall on that list, then, I don't know if there's a way to need like a good arguer, a good argument to leave them,
Right.
at the least, if, anyway,
Well, yeah, getting the word out there, and I think revamping the brochure is a great idea. And if we could have a celebration or something associated with that, what could come out. Like you said, have a resolution, mayor read it,
yeah,
all of that would, I think, get the word out that we're trying to care for these trees.
I think just PR for the city, it would be great because, I mean, not that the city's not doing anything wrong, but to get ahead of that type of stuff is nice, because when people find out later on that like we are finding out or know already, it's kind of, our hands are tied. So, and maybe, the public seems to have a lot of sway in what goes on, sometimes a lot more than policy. So,
Yeah,
um, if, if there was a tree that was potentially gonna come down because of some project and the public could really bargain, with some leverage of some kind, then maybe that would be more effective. And then at least we're kind of on the right side of that of, doing our part to, at least say that, we're not like open to every single tree getting taken down just to make things a little easier. If there's a legitimate reason and yeah, they need it, then okay, but,
at
but if
least
there's a
show,
way,
yeah, at least show that there's been a conversation, that all avenues have been tried to save it.
yeah, I don't know if there's just, I know when they go through planning, all development has to do a lot of work with planning, and if there's just some sort of, mediation, you know, the facts of what the project is and the facts of the tree and the location and, you know, they have to like make their case at least, then, you know, it's something they have to, you know, get ready for at least.
Something defensible.
Yeah,
That's,
yeah.
And would that be something that would come up during the site plan evaluation, like the very first contact when a
I think it's later.
developer or builder comes for a permit? I mean, how would that work?
I think it would be in the plan review process, but I'm also not super in the loop with the private development process, so I'd have to defer to Mose or, you know, some of our planning group in City Hall to, I just don't know. There is, you know, steps in that process, obviously, depending on what they're doing. A single family house is simpler than a, you know, multifamily, multi-lot development somewhere in town that, you know, kind of different set of processes, but that is somewhere in that process. And the primary thing that we have as of today, and this is not not a great substitute for you know, maintaining a church tree in the right of way, for example, in the right context, but if a developer is, you know, if their development is compliant with city code otherwise, and it would ultimately require the removal of, you know, say 2 right-of-way trees or something like that. That doesn't mean that that location is treeless in the future. They are still required to comply with our tree code, meaning so if they had to remove those 2 trees, if they had to remove those 2 trees and, you know, they finish their development, they're still required to plant trees
Right.
in compliance with our code, meaning, you know, however much frontage they have, there's a ratio of you have to have 1 tree every 50 feet kind of thing. So that doesn't maintain a larger tree, but it does mean, you know, if you had say a large oak tree, for example, and it, you know, would be hitting a constructed building, then that tree needed to be removed. They would be required to plant an appropriate tree for the
Okay, so that-
location. So, you know, if you have a large mature tree that's removed, you place it in this context with a smaller ornamental tree that is not gonna grow and cause problems for that building or property down. So it's the right tree, right place conversation that I harp on quite a bit. But that's exactly, you know, the use case for that sort of line.
And how do you as commissioners feel about that? Is that, is that
So,
appropriate, or, I mean,
well,
would you, what different steps would you take if you had the,
so mostly what I'm seeing is probably gonna be the potential issue is in the downtown commercial area where the setbacks are 0 feet.
true,
So there's not much room for anything. Even a small tree that's 20 feet tall is, the canopy is nearly gonna touch the building. So, you know, and I don't know that there's gonna be, you know, 20 projects downtown in the next few years that are, you know, potentially there could be a lot more though, because uh, Sandpoint has a code that can be, there's a loophole that's can be manipulated in the favor of a lot of density. And cities, the planning is definitely doing a lot of overtime work to try to get ahead of a few things to help change that to where it's not so excessive. But the comp plan does say that higher density areas are to be encouraged and lower parking requirements to help encourage that also, because the downtown core has the ability for people to not have to own a car. And so parking is more the idea is that parking is more at the will of the city to provide than property owners or developers, because properties are, you know, small, so one parking lot
right?
doesn't really hold a lot of cars compared to how many residences they could, or units it could house. So like if you could potentially put 30 units on one lot, there's no way you could fit 30 parking spaces there, even if, unless it was like garage or the whole first floor or something like which starts to get in the way of development and being like feasible as far as costs. So I don't think that's, I mean, not like I know, I don't have a crystal ball, but potentially those kind of projects could take out, certain right of way trees and whatever gets planted, it's probably not gonna be very big. It probably won't be the same in size.
Right.
But there might need to be a higher density than 1 per 50 feet or something like that. Since there is, you probably wanna plant something smaller that you could do 3 or 4 of them in that much space maybe instead of one. That would probably be what I would say, cause you don't want a big oak tree there, you know, it's gonna grow into the building and you're gonna have more problems and it's gonna get taken down too.
Does the 0 foot setback also apply to the front street side or only the
It's at,
sides and back?
it's at the property line, at the sidewalk.
All the way around?
All the way around, I believe.
It's pretty much all the way around and it seems kind of absurd. When I first heard it, I thought, it just seems like that's a lot of extra work, but if you look at First Avenue, that's
Yeah.
the intent is that the buildings
Right.
touch each other and you're maximizing the property there to, you know, you build up and you build as wide and as, you know, far deep and underground and everything. So the commercial area is taking up less property in the town, in the city limits. And some of these areas, some of the stuff that we've seen has been, uh, I don't think the buildings, they have to be on the side yards. They do have a little bit of a setback. It's not very much. I don't think it's 5 feet.
Yeah, I think you're right. So, one thing I've noticed, when did we do the Cedar Street rejuvenation? How many years ago was that?
The downtown revitalization.
Yeah,
20, I think that began in 2019 and finished in 2020 or 21. I might be off a year or two, but somewhere right around there.
I think the Cedar Street section was 2019.
so one thing I noticed this year, I'm downtown all the time. The trees on Cedar Street in the right of way popped this year. I mean, they are finally to a place where they are looking beautiful and like we feel downtown trees should look. How do you guys feel about that? Those trees, obviously, all of those trees were replaced. There was some pushback, like on the tree in front of iCarts. So sad to see this tree go, but now we've got these beautiful trees of cedar. And they're only gonna get more beautiful. How do you feel about that? I mean, it's only taken, what, 6 years?
All there being that big of a canopy on cedar.
Yeah, I'd say there's probably more now.
I mean, in our lifetime, probably not, but, well, I'm older.
I think it's like on Fifth, when that big project happened, 15 years ago or whatever it was. Those trees got planted, the first round of trees, most of them died and they had to
That's right.
put up, and then they put up the wrong tree or I can't remember.
Yeah, I think they planted the wrong type.
Yeah, so since then, the ones that got planted you're right, I mean, it takes a while, it's not a great habitat for trees usually, so. Yeah, when they start setting in, that's great, because that's what you want. For a while, they look like they're not wanting to be there at all.
Right, like they're not flourishing, and that's kind of what I was seeing. But until this year, and they are actually looking really beautiful. So, I mean, it doesn't take 6 years is not a long time in the scheme of things, really. So I mean, that's one of the cons or the pros to, you know, revitalizing the right of way.
That's a like continual challenge, especially in the downtown core, where trees are in tree wells and surrounded by concrete and then asphalt and street. That's not a very hospitable environment. And you can do the best you can with selecting the right species that can handle that. You can care for them after they're planted. You can do all of those things, but the odds are kind of stacked against them in that context. And that doesn't mean you plant 10 trees, you're gonna have 10 dead trees in 5 years or 2 years. But you might have 6 that make it, and you might have 4 that you have to replace. And obviously, there's always opportunities where, maybe the tree wasn't cared for, that's why it died, or maybe it just died because it was in a really tough environment. And that, for me, that is not necessarily like oh, we just shouldn't do that then. That's, well, you just have you have it in your schedule to monitor those trees, and when you lose some, you you plan to replace them, right? And well, seasonal dependent,
Right.
as soon as possible, when it's appropriate time to plant a tree, primarily in the spring. Fall. And same thing with I'm sure I'm gonna speak incorrectly, Moshe, this is your world, not mine, but in forestry project in the mountains somewhere, there's a timber sale and, the trees were replanted. If they replant 1,000 trees, the more expected mortality rate is like 50%.
Oh, geez.
60-70% in some context. And that's not a bad thing either, but we know those are the statistics. So when you plant 1,000 trees and you expect 400 or 500 of them are gonna make it, at least through the first few years, well, you just have to plan for extra trees or to come back
Come back and
and replant again if necessary. And you just have to be aware of that. That's similar thing. Many of the, trees that are planted in that context are young trees that are planted in a pretty inhospitable environment, steep slopes, unstable soils, various things like that. And you're gonna lose some. And that's just the process. And you plan to replace them. So that's kind of my perspective on it, but that doesn't mean it's just business as usual. There's always things you can do to improve. Like, well, we tried this species before and it really struggled, or we tried this species and it was a wild success. It took off.
So speaking of that, is there records here at the city of what works? Like most said, it didn't work. Some of those didn't work on Fifth, but that was 25 years ago. Do we have records of that? And do we keep records now that will be available in 20 years?
We do, as far as that project from 15 or 20 years ago, I don't know. I haven't looked in particular, but my guess is we have those plans. They may not be digitized. They may be in a flat file somewhere that we have to dig up. But for like the downtown project, downtown phase 1, which was Cedar Street, or phase 2, which was the, north end of First Avenue, we do have those. We have records of those. And obviously, stuff prior to, all of us doing our work on computers is a little bit harder to find than stuff that is all documented on a, server somewhere. And those are a lot easier to dig up, but that's a thing that I think we've continually gotten better at. And further, we do have, and I should have mentioned this earlier, these folks know, but we do have a tree inventory that is publicly available. You can go on and look, and it doesn't have a record necessarily of, there was a tree planted here in 2010 and it died in 2015 and was removed. It doesn't go into that level of detail. But for example, the Cedar Street project, those trees are identified.
Awesome.
And when or if one of those trees dies, there is a few that are dead there that will be replanted. At least one I know on cedar in particular that'll be replanted this fall. We know what was planted there. It's right now it's cut off and there's a stump hanging there, so our parks guys can grab onto it with a backhoe and pull it out when they're ready to replace it. But we do have those records as well. It's a little different than here's a master list of everything. But they are available from various sources. We can usually cobble something together if we don't just have that list in front of us.
If we have to do any research for the historic trees for the brochure, we access the old fashioned paper records?
Probably
That
a
can be
public
you?
records request.
Oh, okay.
But in certain contexts, like if it's something I'm associated with, for the purposes of this, I can just dig it. if it's something that, you know, a private citizen wanted or mission wanted in some context outside of normal business, I think that would be a.
Okay, and actually, that might be something that comes up if and when the downtown Dewey trees
Yeah.
need research.
Absolutely. And I suspect the museum might have some old, you know, plans and drawings of,
Right.
like the building that McDuff's is in, for example.
Mhm.
You know, probably at one point there was trees around McDuff's. There isn't really right now. But even photos are, you
Right.
know, from when Heather Upton was with the city, she, you know, Heather dug into a lot of that stuff and she would show me stuff she found and I get super excited about that stuff. It's like, look at this from 1875 or 1915 or whatever. And that gives you a record, even if it's not, you know, this species was planted this day or whatever, you know, you have a photo of something
Absolutely.
existing there, and that's pretty cool. And we do have a little bit of a modern version of that with, you know, Google Earth and Street View.
True.
Street View does have the, you know, look back at the previous dates where the Street View car drove down the street, and that gives you something to reference as well.
Yeah, it's getting old enough at this point. You can find stuff that's 25 years old,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, I remember when Street View first came out and it like blew me away.
Yeah.
And now they're on like version 9
Oh.
and it's super, super cool.
An invasion of privacy,
It is.
Right, so you
pretty
can
well.
screen that out. I was wondering about plating records, use plating records to look at it near the Moran edition. So something where the story tree is there.
There's certainly some records of those. Like we have in our GIS system, our internal system that are like utilities and, you know, streets are on that mostly the utilities and streets guys maintain. A lot of those, not all of them, but many of those, like with an older development for South Sandpoint or this location, for example, a lot of those plats are linked right on the GIS system. So I can go in and pull up a plat from 1975. And, but those are also variable, you know, at that time, and I'm not sure when it really changed, but previously there wasn't necessarily standards or the standards weren't necessarily enforced. So some of those plats may have that information, others may have nothing related to that, but it's
Yeah.
certainly a resource.
Some of those older ones obviously wouldn't have like landscaping scenarios, but doesn't hurt to look.
Yeah, you never know when you might find a plat that has you know, working on a project in this location and across the street, there was a area that didn't, you know, wasn't yet developed in Sandpoint. And maybe there was just a call out on that plat that says grove of trees or something like
Okay.
that. And that doesn't tell you what they are, it doesn't tell you how old they were or how big they were, but it tells you there was something there. And then it, you know, kind of like what Ellie was describing with the research from the museum's perspective, that gives you a starting point.
Mhm.
And then you go kind of bang on the other sources and see if you can find out some more information. And sometimes you can piece a picture together, other times you kind of run into a dead end. There's a lot of different avenues.
Okay, I think we're ready to move on to our next topic of discussion, which is the arboricultural manual.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us
Oh,
today.
yeah.
You're welcome to stay. That was just me thanking you. I'm not kicking you out by any means. So I took, trying to share my screen here. But a month or two ago, I can't remember exactly when I brought this up, but I had gone through kind of a highlight of, general kind of headlines and chapters and subchapters of the manual. And, let me zoom out. Can you guys see that? Or did I make it worse by doing that?
It could be a little bigger,
Hey,
or we move the screen closer.
I'll zoom in a little more.
That's
How's
better.
that? Okay. So these are just kind of working and I'd have to look back. It might have been the April meeting or the March meeting. But I had this up on the screen at the time and we kind of were talking through the different items and opportunities. But I spent some time going through this and comparing it to our current manual and just seeing, what was in there that was the same, what was different, what needed to be in there that wasn't, that sort of thing. And I just highlighted a handful of things within this document. So the green items where I just say city code, those are referencing items that are otherwise covered in city code. So from my perspective, I don't really see a need to duplicate them in this manual, for example. It's just refer to X section of city code, and that gives you the information you need. And some of those perhaps need to be updated within city code, but that's kind of a different piece. The items I've highlighted in red, this large section from 4.4 on to 4.6.5. These are items, and I go a little further down in here in 6. These are items, and there might be a few that I missed here and there, but that there's standards or documents already prepared by the International Society of Arboriculture, for example. And those are the ones that we were talking about, not reinventing the wheel, not creating our own standards or attempting to write our own standards. We just reference that. If it's an ISA standard drawing, for example, tree planting, staking, we just reference that, and those documents have details in them, and you just reference that detail, or in some cases include it in the manual. I'm absolutely open for discussion on any of those. This was just kind of an exercise in trying to move this forward and highlight, the things that we need to work on as this commission versus the things that we just kind of pull a standard from and insert it into this document, whether it's via a reference or actually including that version of the document. The stuff that's just in white are items that I think are items we do need to decide on, and some of them are just items that I could put in, a summary of, like, for example, permits and procedure. If you're a private property owner and you have a right-of-way tree in front of your property and the tree is dead and you want to remove it, here's how you do that. We have a tree permit in town. You reach out to me, you get a copy of the tree permit, you fill it out, you return it, I come by and inspect. And if, for example, in that case, if the tree is indeed dead, I'll approve the permit. And here's the conditions and what you have to do in tree removal, traffic control plan, if necessary, removing the stump, those sorts of items. There's not really a whole lot, that's just kind of explaining the process. My intention for this is to be a digestible thing for if you just live in Sandpoint and you own a piece of property, or you just own a piece of property and you've got something that needs to happen with one of your trees, here's how you do it. I don't intend for this manual to be a technical manual for, like, tree care professionals. We can absolutely reference that, and that is, I believe, accounted for in appendices, or would be. Maybe I didn't have that. But I think there's kind of two sections in here. There's a property owner section, and that's for homeowners or property owners in general. And then there's if you're a professional tree care company and you're doing something with respect to that, here's the information for you. Because I don't see those two things as being the same. If we try and explain, ANSI 300 in this document, or recreate ANSI 300 in this document, if you're not familiar with how those standards work and you're just a homeowner that has concerns about your tree, that's not likely to benefit you all that much. I see those as kind of being two separate pieces, and the kind of for tree care professionals or whatever, that kind of categorization is. I think that's just an appendix or a section of this document that says, you reference these standards, ANSI 300, various other standards that, that are applicable depending on the context. Anyone have any thoughts or disagree with my highlights or lack thereof? This is by no means a refined version. It was kind of an exercise in trying to move this update forward a little bit. And for me, if I'm looking at this, knowing that from 4.4 to 4.6.5, the ISA has standards for all of these things. You just pull that documentation, insert it in, and you're good. You don't have to, write those sections. The other sections that require, either explanation or a how-to or that sort of thing, I think are where we need to, kind of have draft language and then review and, decide if it's relevant, if we need to include it, if we need to tweak that language, etc.
Yeah, specific to Sandpoint.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one of, I think, the most important things in this document is it's in the appendix section right now, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's where it needs to end up in the document, is the approved and prohibited street tree list. We have a list in the current council adopted arboriculture manual that's, a bit out of date. The majority of the species are still appropriate. Some I think are worthy of consideration either for approved or for prohibited, depending on the context. And we have a more recent version of this list in the Urban Forestry Management Plan, which was completed in 21, which is modern compared to some of the species in the current document that are a bit out of date. And I think we just kind of combine those lists. And, there's certain species that we absolutely don't want planted in the right of way or generally anywhere in town. And there's other species that are on a case by case. Yes, in this situation, it would work. In other cases, no. But I think, again, I don't know that we necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. But kind of looking at revising and reviewing those two versions of the list and then coming up with a, new version for this document. And that's also, there's no way we can make this list all encompassing because there's thousands of species and varieties of trees. But that would be, kind of caveated with a, line that says, subject to the review of the city forester, in some cases, the Urban Forestry Commission. And those are, is this gonna work or is this gonna cause a problem in the future? Kind of thing.
So the intent of this then is to be stewardship type document, a resource for just your average property owners.
Yes,
Thinking
yes, and it's primarily in our urban forestry code and city code generally references this document in various sections. And it's currently out of date, which is why, the whole update is necessary. So it's a little bit of both, and that's why I think it's probably prudent to have, the kind of for homeowners or property owners type section and a, professional section regarding process, but primarily just to comply with city code. And, make sure we're not directing via city code people to a document that doesn't contain the information that's relevant for what they're trying to do. I guess if that makes sense.
Yeah, but we're looking to kind of eliminate duplicity or at least simplify
Yes.
in that regard. There's already the urban forest management plan, and that primarily to guide city council and city staff, where the arboriculture manual is more to guide homeowners. Would
Yes.
that be kind of a fair look at that?
That's a great way to break it.
Yeah,
And,
this is probably on the right track.
and to that point, some of the areas, primarily these ones, 6.1 to 6.4, are items that aren't covered in city code. And some of them are sections that like the ISA would have documentation on. but they're also ones that are covered in various ways in the urban forestry management plan. So I don't want to duplicate that. That document is a council approved document and also referenced elsewhere, in city code. So we don't need to recreate those sections. We can just reference to those sections, or if in cases where they need to be bolstered, for example, we could do that as needed as well.
I have a question.
Sure.
Will the heritage tree, will there be a blurb in this document about the heritage tree? Because it's an educational document?
I believe there should be, and I believe there is currently.
Okay.
I was looking at it earlier today for a few different reasons. And I believe I saw, I just can't remember off the top of my head. And that is also, covered in various contexts in the management plan.
Eric, what do we need to do, the commission, to kind of move forward with this and complete it? What do you see, like, what can we help with?
Well, if everyone's kind of generally in agreement on, the sections I have in here, and we don't need to have a formal vote, I don't know that we can because it wasn't a action item. But I can get this sent out to each commissioner, review it, send me notes, add this section, remove this section, or for example, in, these areas that are, 4.4 to 4.6.5 that the ISA has, or other, organizations have documentation on, like, for example, Jeff's employer, Avista, has documentation on a lot of these things for various contexts too. Send me those. I can pull them. A lot of the ISA stuff's really easy to find. But there may be a better version or a more digestible version that, maybe Avista prepared or another organization prepared that we want to use instead of, a different version. So I'll get this out. We'll get it emailed out to everyone, and then feel free as well if you want to, take a crack at a section, if this is, something that, is, really, really important to you or within your knowledge or whatever. Or send me references to, another municipality or an example. And then I can start to incorporate those and, kind of build the document out via this section, or via this kind of, headline.
Since there's mention of it, I mean, I can explore the invasive species components since that's directly in my wheelhouse.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Probably mention of, IDAPA code, where you can find the full state invasive species list, having mention of that or reference of that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and that helps for the invasive species section, and it also helps for the prohibited tree section.
Yeah.
When appropriate, not every invasive species is a tree, but some are.
so, yeah.
And we definitely want to make sure we account for those. I think the prohibited list in that context matters almost more than the approved list. Because the approved list, if somebody reaches out to me and says, hey, I want to plant this tree in this location, I can evaluate that on a case by case basis. If we have trees that we don't want in the city and they're not included on the prohibited list, it's a little harder to enforce when, when you have a situation where somebody wants to plant something. So that'd be great.
Yeah, so.
I'd love your knowledge on that.
Yeah, when you send that out, that'll be the component that I'll probably focus on.
Great.
And for, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
All right,
Awesome. Well, that's all I've got here. We'll get this out and, take a look and send me some notes, comments, information.
yeah, I think it'd be cool to get it all together and have it done,
Yeah.
yeah.
Kind of this exercise and highlighting this, I was kind of doing for my own purposes. And then I was like, you know what? I think this is actually pretty helpful. When I look at, 1 through, well, the numbers kind of restart, but 1 through 8 with a bunch of subheadings and then appendices and whatever, it seems overwhelming. But then you kind of highlight this and you're like, well, I don't really need to do this section because we have a lot of that already. I don't need to do this because other organizations have already prepared it. So it helps kind of compartmentalize it and make it not seem like such a, massive undertaking. And I don't want this document to be 100 pages, 150 pages. I think our current one's like 23 pages, and I think that's a good size. If you're just wanting to know what you can do or not do with your tree or how to maintain your tree, and somebody hands you a 100-page document, you're like, whoa, And that's not what I was wanting to get into, but if someone hands you 20 pages, okay, I can,
Yeah, it's a good way that it won't get read.
exactly.
People just decide not.
Exactly.
Attention spans are
Yeah.
short
Yeah.
anymore, so yeah, the more concise, the better.
Granted, I would read a 150 page or 1,000 page document on that, but I also like trees. If that's not your cup of tea necessarily, or you're not interested in it, then, you know, if you gave me a 100 page accounting document,
Yeah, you know,
probably wouldn't get my interest for too long.
Gotta make it quick and easy for the person.
yeah, all right, I think we can move on now. We have no new business. So the next on the agenda would be announcements, comments, general in nature or whatever, anything that you're thinking of that we haven't talked about or anything has come up from commission or staff.
I have one, that is, gonna be a, update to city council at, next week's meeting. But city council has already been aware of this from, conversations in the fall. I just need to get my, there we go. So, I believe I've mentioned to, the commission at maybe one of our first couple meetings, in the fall of 2024, September, August or September of last year. I was, contacted by some, folks from Idaho Department of Lands that are entomologists and had identified the presence of the spongy mouth in Sandpoint. Thankfully, one sample or one specimen and not, you know, not a large outbreak or anything, but because of that and because IDL has, you know, the resources and ability to track and monitor these sort of things. I've been working with their entomologists throughout the winter and they're enacting a larger scale monitoring system in Sandpoint and this portion of Bonner County generally for this summer. So this on our website under the urban forestry page, if you go to departments and then urban forestry down here and you click on that, I'll just kind of navigate to it again. On the left-hand side here, on the drop down, there's a spongy moth FAQs. And this was posted on the website a few weeks ago. This was prepared by the IDL folks as a kind of, you know, handout document that explains what the spongy moth is, why it's, you know, concerning, etc. And the most important thing is they are installing, yeah, I think it's in here somewhere, but I think it's around 1,000 traps in our local area within city limits. And I believe it also includes Dover, Ponderay, the Bonner County on the west side of city limits. And the traps pretty much look like this on the picture on the screen. And the idea is to verify that we don't have an outbreak in Sandpoint. They suspected that by only finding one specimen of the spongy moth that it might have been a hitchhiker from, you know, somebody's vehicle or came in on, you know, a pallet or lumber materials or something like that. But because they found one, they're, you know, stepping up the monitoring to verify that we don't have an outbreak. So IDL is going to start deploying these traps, I believe, next week throughout town. And their intention is to not put them like at the base of a stop sign where somebody can walk by and grab them and destroy them. Their intention is to kind of put them in locations where they're visible. Not all of them are visible, but where they're visible, but also not subject to damage, you know, by trespassing or, you know, just general destruction. So fingers crossed, we only had one specimen and this large monitoring program this summer is not, you know, finding us at risk of losing our oak trees and other species. But that's kind of what's going on with this. I'm hopeful that it was just the one, but we'll know when they, you know, complete the trapping and collect the traps at the end of the season and, you know, prepare their report. They'll let us know what they found. But that's been going on. I've been working with those guys and the IDL folks are fantastic. They're an amazing resource. We're lucky to have them keeping an eye on this because if there was an outbreak, I certainly hope there isn't, but if there was, we may not have known until it was too late. I'm not an entomologist. I can identify when something's struggling, but I may not be able to identify why it's struggling. And, you know, if it's something like the spongy moth.
Yeah, that's bad news if it becomes widespread.
Yeah.
It's like early detection's key and keeping small issues small.
And it's not, the spongy moth is not necessarily a death sentence like the emerald ash borer, for example. But you can lose a significant amount of your trees that, you know, or that are affected. We definitely know, you know, that could be a major loss. Because they don't just affect oak trees, they kind of prefer oak trees, is my understanding. But if they don't have oak trees, they'll zero in on other species.
I think spruce and
Douglas fir.
yeah, I think Doug fir,
A lot
yeah,
of conifers too.
yeah,
Mhm.
because 2010, there was, I think there was a pretty big population, especially south of Wayne, that just took thousands of acres. But from what I know, at least from what I remember, is there can be a large number of them and it'd be kind of normal. It's when they get to be very large numbers where they take out a lot of young, like they like the young growth, like the new needles, the newest stuff that's easy to eat, it's real soft, and that's like the newest life of the tree too, so. See trees like, I think spruce trees or there's another species, I can't think, but the top 3-4 feet of it will be dead. Cause they just eat that new growth that's, you know, the easiest to get to.
Yeah. So I remain hopeful. It's not an outbreak and it was just a kind of one-off that they found, but I'm also extremely glad that IDL does this because we wouldn't know if, you know, if they weren't doing that. They do this statewide for all sorts of invasive species and you know, things that'll cause harm to the landscape. So I'm really thankful for them. They've been amazing to work with.
The Japanese beetle is another significant one.
Yeah.
So when did they change it from gypsy moth?
Yeah.
Cause I mean,
I don't know. I think is, just kind of one of those things that they've changed, kind of like the, you know, dusky grouse to blue grouse conversation. I don't really know when that happened either and why it happened, but, I think it's just one of those. I think there's multiple species of moths that are categorized as gypsy moth. And maybe that was the differentiator, you know, why they had to kind of break them out, but again, that's not my area, so I might be mistaken on that.
That's just common names. Common names are just always subject to change. For,
Yeah,
you know, whatever reason.
yeah.
Be it,
It's same thing with trees, right?
Yeah.
You know, a silver maple is called a silver maple in some locations, it's called a water maple in other locations, it's called, you know, lots of common names for trees or plant materials have regional names. And that's why we have the Latin, so we all know what we're talking about.
yes, that's the Latin is static, but the common names, and you have something that could get confused with something else, and that's often why something like that can change.
That's all I've got as far as an update.
okay, any commissioners or?
Just a quick question, Eric, the former, what was formerly called the Foreman Flats project, you had some info on that you were gonna bring to the commission? Is it
Yeah, and
still gonna be on the?
And well, that was part of the conversation with legal with respect to that, because legal's interpretation and legal's, you know, kind of direction was that the Urban Forestry Commission can't review private development applications. The code dictates that process, and the code being, you know, they're either complying with the development or they aren't. And that's kind of planning and zoning's area to review. So I did mention that at the last our meeting last month, and then had a conversation with legal about it and was directed that that is not allowed. So sorry for the you know, kind of uncertainty with that.
Yeah, just back up, on those, this exact conversation I had too, cause I expected we would potentially get into discussion on that, and so learning experience.
Wasn't that a condition of approval for that?
Well, I think that's what planning and zoning put in there, but I don't think it had any, I don't think it really, maybe we weren't allowed to, or
okay.
but it's not like a true condition, I
Mm.
guess. It kind of sound, it's like if planning and zoning said, hey, we'd like you to build a fence, and they don't have to, and they could still just push it forward. No. It's all the. So that one didn't go to city council. So that's another feature of it too, but so normally whatever goes through P and Z goes through council, ultimately, they have to say, so. Or some. We did ask for one more parking space in the back for. They do, but I think the tree thing. They just said like, just go forward anyway. But we're also at the point where like earlier discussion of like the site plan review and all that, like. That once the building permit is issued, like tree thing will probably come up officially in staff, and I think they'll.
Hmm.
If they say that they got.
So legally, you can solicit input on city-related projects like the downtown parking lot and the Cedar Street East, West Cedar Street, but the private development projects are the ones that legally then are off limits for us.
That's my understanding.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe if it was more of like a conditional use permit or like a, planned urban development or something.
Yeah, conditional use permit. Like planning and zoning has a lot of freedom, or you can make up a lot of, you can ask for a lot. If they can offer a lot and it's agreed on, and then that decision is final with P and Z. On planned urban developments, it's similar, bigger scale. Usually a lot of parking. Make density happen or lot sizes favorable.
I guess the difference is that in those two scenarios, that property owner doesn't have the right to that. So like you said earlier, if they're not asking for any concessions in the zoning, if they're following all of our zoning rules on the books, then we don't really have a right to tell them how they can build what they're gonna build. But if they are asking us for a conditional use permit or a PUD, then they don't have any right to be awarded that, and we have the right to just say no. So we can say, well, we'll allow you to do that thing that's not allowed in our code if you do something like save these trees, for example.
Yeah, but I don't know if we can speak directly on that specific event actually, but something like that. If they came forward and they complied everything that the law says, if they comply with all that and don't ask for anything outside of it, then we can't make them do anything different. Right? You can't say, hey, you could build another story if you kept those trees or something like that, because I don't, you know. Sometimes
Yeah, the way I understand it is, say for example, a developer wanted to build a building that, and the finishing was neon paint. Who would do that? Just as a theoretical. If the code did not say, here's the colors you can use, or here's the colors you can't use. If they want to build a building hot pink, you can't tell them no.
Right.
It may be a bad design choice, it may be ugly, it may be all those other things, but if it otherwise complies with with the zoning code and city code generally, you can't preclude them from doing it just because you don't like neon.
Yeah, the comp plan does talk about, the neighborhood look or design features or something of the. But even that is, it's not like law. You have to, it's more like a guide of like, be creative. Usually project would have, usually they would be asking for something out of, it's not allowed or it's. Usually they want the lot size to be smaller. So. That would be the area where you could say, well, change the color from pink to. You can have what I've been told, and I think maybe it's a little bit of opinion or what, but it's not like a great policy for a city to get into a lot of bargaining to where every lot ends up being able to get exactly what they want just by asking and, essentially, and then the code kind of just it's all over the place throughout the city, throughout the zone. And see a lot of stuff where code is not been followed or people just built stuff and didn't ask or they got what they wanted just by asking and staff from a long time ago or P and Z or whatever, just or there was some sort of loophole that they taken advantage of, which definitely happens. Because you go through a lot of cities, there's stuff that doesn't really look the same. And there's different people on P and Z and different city council, different mayors, different directions of comp plans. That's a big one is, the city has talked about higher density, to combat, affordable housing issues and so forth. And so, sometimes cities get a little too much of what they ask for. That wasn't the intent when, they wanted stuff to be, to help, to try to take care of an issue. And later on, you realize, wow, we just opened the door for a lot that we didn't expect, because you kind of think, well, is anybody really gonna do that? And then you got a pink building somewhere or whatever, yeah, just because, they want to do it. So, all right, is there any other discussion?
I did have one more quick question for you. I was thinking through this as we were talking through the other items. And you did mention go to the museum staff about with the outstanding trees brochure and see if there's historical items related to those trees. Does your commission have a list of historic buildings that we could maybe go to and look at the trees around them and say, well, that tree's obviously over 100 years old and it's next to a historic building, so that would probably fit that same description of a historic tree.
We do, we have the walking tour brochure.
Okay,
And it's similar to the tree brochure where we have downtown buildings and also residential. And I believe they have them in the lobby here at the
perfect,
city, so yeah.
great. So that might be another place to look for
Yeah.
historic trees that.
I forgot
fit
about that.
description.
I've done that whole walking tour on a series of lunches over a
Mhm.
period of weeks, and there's all sorts of cool stuff to see, just from the architectural perspective, but I didn't think about it. You
Yeah.
looking at that with respect to trees too, that's a good idea to
Yeah.
help categorize them.
Absolutely. Great work, everybody.
Okay, so with no further business on the agenda, this meeting is now adjourned at 4:33. Oh.